The first weekend of the 2026 Formula One season has been very up and down, which is why I put in the thumbnail hope and chaos, because we've had some hope after seeing that race and quite a lot of fun laps, especially between Mercedes and Ferrari, but even some pretty nice battles in the midfield that we'll talk about that made the racing look pretty decent. Now, there's still a lot of problems around these 2026 cars, which is why we're going to go over the weekend as a whole, what we ended up learning, and in which direction F1 is going to go for the rest of the year. The gap isn't as big as we thought it was. There will still be quite a few teams fighting for victories in this season, and a lot can be gained through both aero and engine. So, let's talk about the first weekend in Formula One. If you're new to channel, go ahead and subscribe. Thank you all for the support. Let's get started with the video. With the race being finished, that's one of the first things that I want to talk about, and especially the race start. Now, here's where the chaos comes in. We knew the race start was going to be very dodgy, as we've seen a lot of these practice starts, and sometimes certain cars will not get off the line correctly. Even before the race in some practice sessions, we ended up seeing Lando try and do a couple of race starts, and they looked quite pathetic to say the least. George Russell even stated at the very end of the GP that him and Kimi had no battery getting up to the line, which is why their race starts so poor. And Charles made a ridiculous start from fourth, overtaking them all and pretty much ran right past Haijar at some point. Now, that is an advantage that Ferrari has. They ended up taking that route during the winter season, and it worked out. Mercedes has another advantage in lasting longer in their battery deployment. So this is a choice that they could have made. In my opinion, these race starts, while it could be chaotic, and of course we almost end up seeing a very big accident between Lawson and Colinto, and then even Checo kind of getting caught up into it, skill is kind of associated with these starts, and it's just kind of part of the sport. I don't think there's any necessary change. They've already added that additional 5 seconds. Safety is of course most important, but I don't think you can take the nature out of Formula One. Can't change these starts that much without completely ruining what's been iconic for a long time. Sometimes it will be unsafe. That is what Formula One is. Alonso made a crazy start as well in that very quick Honda Aston Martin, and made a nasty overtake even into turn 3 on Beralto. He was putting it in for the very little amount of time that Honda wanted to actually last, and they used it as a glorified test session. Now, of course, in the race there were plenty of overtakes. Some people are going to call it manufactured, but at the end it looked like pretty decent racing, especially between the front runners and Mercedes till the VSC came out, and you know Ferrari in typical Ferrari fashion doing what they do best, messing up strategy. And some people are not going to be a fan of getting what even Charles Leclerc called a mushroom boost, which is a Mario Kart reference if you don't know. This is like a mushroom in Mario Kart. But the fighting going into corners where they were neck and neck, these small agile cars actually looked pretty decent. Russell said there was a bit of understeer, so it was a bit tricky, but the defending was nice and it was very clean between the two front runners. I thought this was outstanding, and it actually had me smiling from ear to ear and did give me a lot more hope when it comes to the racing aspect of these cars on a track where this regulation period was never going to look great. Hopefully in the future they can change that. I think the race in general, when there were close battles, we ended up seeing Max Verstappen make a lot of overtakes. Kimi Antonelli, because he ended up having that horrible start. All the overtakes that were made didn't look like it was just abused because of that overtake button. There's some strategy associated with it, which I think is pretty smart, and the drivers can use that to their advantage on where they want to deploy. We ended up seeing a lot of overtakes into turn 1, which is something we haven't seen in a long time. That corner never used to have overtakes. Turn 3 had plenty of overtakes. And while that was sometimes happening in the previous regs, it was extremely rare. Most of the overtakes that we ended up seeing in the previous regs was turn 11. We saw overtakes in turn 9, in turn 3, turn 1, even turn 11. So the track became a lot more accessible to the drivers, which I think is a good thing at the end of the day. Do I still think there needs to be a bit of refinement in how they are deploying this boost and overtake? Probably. But considering the engines, don't look too far off. Yes, Mercedes is the quickest. We've seen that in qualifying. The actual race pace looked pretty consistent. Now, a big thing that came out of this race was Mercedes is not just dominating like we thought they would. I honestly expected after what we saw in qualifying to see about a 45-second gap. If Ferrari made the choice of pitting under the VSC and Leclerc and George Russell were going head-to-head, the actual pace looked very identical between the top 4 teams. Max looked a ways away, but that was only during the very last segment of the race. Lando by the end of the race actually was matching the leaders Leclerc and Russell, and out of all of them, Lewis Hamilton looked the most consistent and was the quickest driver on track for a while there. Now, the Mercedes did look pretty good on its tyre degradation. McLaren is struggling from that end. Ferrari wasn't bad in his tyre degradation as well. I think they made a mistake on the strategy because they didn't pit twice under the VSC. Other than that, Scarlet versus Silver, it could have been very close. There's still a pretty decent gap to the midfield, as Max pretty much just ran through everybody with the exception of the RB car where Arvid showed, in my opinion, very little hints of how Max used to be back in the day, especially in his rookie season. He was feisty out there fighting for every position, was extremely quick, and was the most impressive driver. I actually think he was my number 1 for this race for what he was able to achieve. Points on debut, same as Audi. What a job. And Gabby as well. And Alpine's scoring points, which I did not think was going to happen. Man looked great, which is something that I suspected. And Allen and Gasly had their battle for a bit. Of course, that got quite feisty. But other than Cadillac, when Aston actually turns up with a better engine, I could see them leading the front of the pack when it comes to the midfield. The car looks strong in corners, but as soon as it came to those straights, they were losing a stupid amount of kph. And there was no reason for them to even race. It was insane what Alonso ended up doing on that first lap. But that's a big if. They got to fix that reliability, and we'll have to see what ends up happening for the next GP, which is happening next week. So, let's see if they can even compete and do it correctly. Of course, Checo and Lawson first time meeting back on track. Had to have a little bit of action. I thought that was pretty hilarious. But with this being our first race, there were so many fights to cover. It was a bit tricky to really get the TV to catch everything, but I do think the racing looked much better. There's hope there. I don't think it's fully there yet. And while they keep refining these rules in a season, which is just something that we're gonna have to get used to, it wasn't all bad. But where it was really bad in this weekend, I do think is qualifying. And I do want to make this a point in this video. I just think it's unacceptable. And it's a very dangerous look from the outside for newer F1 fans to see these cars going so slow on those streets and losing up to 60 km/h just to be able to recharge the battery. That's not what a Formula 1 car should do. So, fixing that issue in qualifying has to be a number 1 priority for them. I do think that was the best session by far in the ground effect era. It was obvious that the cars looked on rails. There was so much skill being put into those cars in high-speed corners. And now that driver skill looks like it's been taken out, it doesn't look bad at all in medium speed and slow speed. But in high speed, if the car can't go full throttle and you actually get all that power, then the drivers just aren't able to put in everything in a lap, which is what qualifying is supposed to be. In the race, this was less apparent. Yes, there was recharging, but yeah, we've always had lifting coast. It hasn't been the worst thing, so we can ignore it a bit more in the race and it isn't as big of a problem. If you want to be anal about it, then of course you're going to see every little thing. But even I can look past it. So, I don't think that's the biggest issue. Qualifying that has to be settled. It cannot look like how it looked. Yes, this is going to be one of the worst tracks of the year when it comes to this recharge mode, and just this very odd looking are they actually pushing, are they not? But there are other tracks where this could look even worse, like Monza. I think the cars are just going to look awful there. It'll be interesting to see, and that is a must change. I do think the chaos is mainly associated with qualifying, but these cars will get a lot quicker in the year, so I don't think the times are going to be an issue whatsoever, especially as they add upgrades. I have heard some people complain that there is still a decent amount of dirty air. Now, this track doesn't really show it off that well. I saw a lot of following out of 9 and 10, which I thought was a corner before that was extremely hard to follow in because of the dirty air, and drivers were able to also keep up with the cars from behind in Sector 3, which is another tricky section in the previous regs. So, all in all, it doesn't look bad. But I do think it's going to get a little bit worse, of course, as more pieces get added to these cars. I think we left off on a better note than we did Saturday, obviously, with qualifying, but still changes to be made. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the comments below. I think this is going to be quite divided for a while, but the rules will be changing, and I think Formula 1 will settle. That is my hope. Thank you all for stopping by. Please leave a like, subscribe. It would mean the world, and peace.